This work is complemented usually by derivative products such as operational handbooks, which provide advice on how to implement the recommendations. And you could see that over the past few years, we significantly optimized the process, and the updates happen more regularly, and we are trying to release guidelines together with the operational handbooks to be sure that updates happens as soon as possible. However, we all know, of course, that this year was a very unusual, unprecedented year for all of us, for public health. With the COVID-19 pandemic, testing how we work, how we can be more proactive, more responsive, and more innovative in addressing public health challenges. In this regard, we are organizing today this webinar to share with you on how we are working to update and disseminate WHO policy on TB in 2021, and how to support the best possible way to national TB programs. The main objectives of these webinars are to share our plans, as I told, for TB policy development, as well as other supportive implementation tools, and of course to hear from you, your perspectives, how we can be engaged on regular basis and closer, and how we can collectively better drive a country needs-driven policy development and help to scale up the implementation of interventions. As you will hear in this webinar from our excellent panelists, there is a lot of ongoing work to support national TB programs in the context of available evidence, but more needs to be done in research to address unmet needs and to fast-track implementation of policy guidance. The presenters and panelists here today will share their perspective also on the ongoing work, as well as challenges and opportunities, including our lessons learned from COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to thank you once again for prioritizing this webinar in your agendas, for joining us today. I am sure we will spend very useful time. We will receive your comments, and now with this, I would like immediately to give floor to the chair of today's webinar, my colleague, Dr. Matteo Ziniolo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for your words of introduction. It's a pleasure for us to be here today with you to share some of the recent updates of our work on policy guidance in the area of TB control, but also to hear from you and to hear from the panelists that we have with us today. So we will have 2 hours. The first hour will be one presentation from WHO colleagues, followed by a panel discussion, and we look forward to hearing from our guests today. And then the second hour will be entirely devoted to question and answer. So I kindly ask you to type your questions in the Q&A session at any time while you hear the presentation. Please type your questions, and then as soon as we'll have time for a discussion, which is, as I said, is going to be 1 full hour, we will go through all your questions. So I look forward to a very lively debate today, and I'll start introducing the first presentation. As I said, the presentation is from a WHO, and it will be delivered by 4 colleagues And the topic of the presentation is an update on the WHO TB policy guidelines development throughout the spectrum of TB. The four presenters are Dr. Dennis Falstone, Dr. Nazir Ismail, Dr. Fouad Mirzayev, and Dr. Kerry Vinay. I hand over to Dennis to start off the presentation.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So the presentation going to be shared? Okay, yeah, I'm seeing it now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nabil. So this presentation, I'm going to do the first part, and then I will hand over to my other colleagues to deal with the rest. So maybe we can go to the first slide. Thank you very much. So I will start first giving a bit of details about this, the new TB sharing, knowledge sharing platform that Global TB Program has created and the recommendations mapping. And then I will also present a few highlights from the prevention and screening aspects of our guidelines. So next slide, please. Okay, so I can start maybe with the TB knowledge sharing platform and recommendations mapping. Next slide. So first of all, slide before, please. Yeah, thanks. So before maybe we go to that, I'd like to mention the work that has been done over the last year by Global TB Program to present the recommendations and the guidelines in a more consolidated manner. We have produced now guidelines and continue to produce guidelines in a modular fashion. And these are the 5 modules that have been selected for grouping of the guidelines within them. So there is prevention, screening, diagnosis, treatment, and special needs and populations. There is a color coding to the left of the words there, surrounding numbers. And that is a color coding that we're using in the front pages of the guidelines. Next slide, please. So the guidelines are coming out in this modular fashion. You see here 2 of the two guidelines from 2 of the modules. So you see module 3 and module 4 over here, dealing with diagnosis and TB treatment, respectively. And the characteristic as well of the guidelines is that they are, when they are launched, they are also accompanied by operational handbooks. And you can see over here two of these. Next slide, please. The TB knowledge sharing platform is the main way that we will be disseminating new guidance as the Global TB Program. It is sometimes referred to as a microsite, and the whole idea is that we'll have an online one-stop shop to access our guidelines, and also accompanied by resources such as the implementation guidelines or the operational handbook, and also a library of e-learning and other training materials. We have started working on this TB knowledge sharing platform since last year, and we are planning to launch the first sort of version of it in April, next month. Next slide, please. So this is the front screen of the TB knowledge sharing platform. So it will be available both as a desktop application as well as a mobile app. And you can see that it will have these 3 panels, so to speak: the guidelines, the handbooks, and the training catalog. And these will be reflected in both the desktop app and the mobile application. The mobile application will be, once downloaded, will be available offline. Next slide, please. And you can see also reflected in the different parts of the platform the modular structure of the guidelines and the other parts of the platform. Next slide, please. And the training catalog will also be a very critical part of the whole. It will link up to the Open WHO platform. So the training materials will be uploaded to the WHO, openwho.org, and then accessible also via the platform itself. Next slide, please. Another feature that will be also available through the knowledge sharing platform is the recommendation mapping. This is a separate piece of work that we have been doing with our colleagues from McMaster University and Evidence Prime. And the whole idea is to have all the individual recommendations in all of the TB guidelines that we have and which are still valid, available as a database. And we have close to 200 recommendations at this point in time. And the recommendations, again, will be organized in this modular manner. You see, for instance, here the prevention module, which is broken down into 2 sub-modules, infection control and TB preventive treatment. Likewise, treatment will have 2 sub-modules, and the special needs and populations will also have a number of sub-modules in it. So when you click inside these, you can find the recommendations listed over there. You can also use the search functions, the filter that you have on the sides. And when you feature a recommendation, then you can go to the next slide, please. By clicking the recommendation itself, you can find a lot of this information. Click again, please. And a lot of this information over here will be the features of a recommendation that people expect to have about its strength, the evidence, the quality of the evidence surrounding it, and also access to the evidence summaries and the other tools that in which there is a documented documentation of the guideline development group decisions. Next slide, please. Again, all of this will link up eventually to the Grade Pro framework within which we have been over the last years consolidating our information on the background information about the guidelines, and this will create a better, sort of more transparent audit trail of all the information that is backing the recommendations themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, so I will give a few highlights from the recent guidelines and the guidelines of the immediate future. Next slide, please. So this is about the prevention module. So I think many of you are aware that 1 year ago during World TB Day, we launched the first in the series of the consolidated guidelines, the module 1 on TB preventive treatment. And these guidelines updated the ones that came before. They are organized around the 4 sort of critical steps in the TB preventive care pathway: identifying people at risk of TB, ruling out disease, testing for TB infection, and the different TPT options. And you have 18 recommendations there relating to all of these different aspects. Next slide, please. Accompanying the guidelines as well, there was the operational handbook, okay, same modular series. And this one presents all the important details that need the implementer would need to know in order to implement these recommendations. How to, for instance, strengthen contact investigation, which is one of the weak links in a lot of the preventive work that we do. How to do sort of to monitor treatment, start treatment, accompany people who have to take TPT, etc. Details about the implementation tools, how to choose between the different regimen options that are available, and also other important annexes relating to, let's say, messaging, relating to how to do testing, how to counsel, etc. Next slide, please. Another important component of the prevention, within the prevention module, is infection control. We have our latest guidelines, which came out 2 years ago, and we are now working with partners to develop a handbook which will complement those guidelines. And so we will start working on this from next month, and the discussion is already ongoing. Yeah, we can move to the next module, which is screening, number 2. Next slide, please. We have been busy over the last year updating the screening guidelines of 2013. As you may remember, there were also operational guidelines available in 2015 related to screening. Because of the COVID, the process for the guideline development group was converted completely virtual. We had to prolong the period of meetings, but I think the meetings were very rich, very interesting, and there was an amazing amount of data which we looked at, and the recommendations will come out on Monday. So something I think to look forward to. I think you have already seen the highlights presented in the rapid communication that we issued last December. And once more, we are preparing operational guidance on to accompany this and to update the 2015 document. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are some of the major highlights that are in the guidelines. So first of all, for the first time, we have a recommendation about the use of computer-aided detection, CAD, for pulmonary TB on digital chest X-ray for screening and triage in people aged 15 years and over. And then we also, for the first time, are recommending the use of MWRDs like Expert or TrueNAT to be used for screening in people who are older than 14 and at risk, including people living with HIV, and also the use of C-reactive protein in people living with HIV. And there are also new recommendations for that previously existed, this broader use of chest X-ray, including for people living with HIV and child contacts, and also the lowering of the TB prevalence thresholds in order to consider general population screening, lowering down to 0.5% or higher. Next slide, please. Okay, and there will be also a number of tools as well to help the implementers. So we'll have revised algorithms. You can see some of them in miniature on the top over there. There is a revised screen TB tool. You may recall this tool that has been there for a number of years and helps to estimate the yield and the cost of screening. So there will be a refreshed version of this coming up. And also for the first time, the CAD calibration package that will help countries to implement the CAD according to their specific needs. With that, I would like to thank all my team members who have been working very hard to make this available, alongside the TDR and many other partners, the GDGs that have been involved, of course, and the NTPs and the other partners. So thank you very much for all of this and to make this possible. Thanks very much. So with that, I think I can hand over to my colleague Nazir to go to diagnosis. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. Excellent cover of the topic so far. I'll present on diagnostics for TB and sort of complements what Dennis has been speaking about, from screening to diagnosis. So next slide. Yeah, so just for those that don't know, we have, as Dennis has indicated, for the screening and other topics, we've consolidated guidelines last year in 2020, and these green books should be familiar to people. These are two sets of books, one consolidated guidelines and the other a consolidated operational handbook. And I've just listed the main sections within the document. So these are the different technologies for which we have recommendations from WHO. And in the 2020, the addition was the TrueNAT assay. But you'll see vast number of these assays are really nucleic acid amplification tests, aiming at rapid diagnosis. And then the last one is on LF-LAM. Next slide, please. So what's new in 2021 and going forward? So we've just concluded the guideline development group in December and reviewed 3 new classes of technologies. So again, this is something new in the WHO space for diagnostics, a move towards class-based recommendations for diagnostics. So we reviewed 3 new classes. The first, what we call moderate complexity automated NAATs, and these detect rifampicin and INH and are rapid assays with brands that are quite familiar in the diagnostic space for both TB and HIV, and have performed very well. overall for rapid detection of TB, but also INH in combination, which is an important step forward in addressing diagnosis for INH resistance upfront. The second important new addition and complements what we'll hear from Fuad later on is the low complexity automated NAATs for detection of INH in second-line anti-TB agents. This is the XDR cartridge, and this was the first-in-class technology. And really the key focus for this one is really around fluoroquinolone resistance detection, which is quite important for not only drug-resistant TB, which is a key area, but may have other values as well. And then lastly, a first in class as well for parazinamide resistance detection based on a molecular assay, and this has been a new addition, though fairly limited based on isolate detection. So next slide. So the plans for this year, so we've provided the rapid communication on just the key findings from the guideline development group in December. But the plans are basically to update the consolidated guidelines and operational handbooks to incorporate these new technologies and ensure that the algorithms, etc., are sort of integrated with the new technologies coming to the front for rapid diagnostics. And we expect this to be out by end of May or beginning of June this year. Next slide. So that covers really a lot on diagnosis of TB disease, which has been a big focus of the past few years. And the second half of the year will focus on TB infection and updating guidance around tests in this domain. I think of key importance is the new TB-specific skin tests that are increasingly becoming available, DiaSkin, CTB. There's a few other technologies that are coming to market and really provides an alternative to TST and offers a more specific TB test. So this is something new and important that complements some of the prevention work. And then in addition, there has been some new blood-based IGRAs that have come onto market in some more simplified formats as well. And that's something that we would like to consider for the second half of the year. The plans are to hold a guideline development group around Q4 to review this evidence and develop updated policies for testing for TB infection. And also just to note, if people have not seen it already, there's been a public announcement on the process for TB diagnostics and PQ and how this pathway will work. But specifically for this TB infection assays, we're working on a process for PQ assessments to be included in the process for LTBI test evaluations. So I think that ends it for me. And we can move over to the next presentation, but happy to take questions on the chat. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, what?
Okay, great. So I'll continue with a couple of slides related to treatment. And first of all, thank you all the participants who joined and stay on in this webinar. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So just it's difficult to really galvanize everything about the treatment into a couple of slides, but here I will try to do that with the guidelines on TB treatment. The WHO guidelines been appearing in different documents and then started to be formalized into the specific publications, the documents. It goes back almost 3 decades. And they were always following these two pathways, more or less, the drug-susceptible TB treatment and drug-resistant TB treatment. At some point at around 2007, 2008, after WHO adopted the GREAT approach for the guidelines development, all following guidelines were using that approach. In addition to the guidelines, there were several normative, derivative documents, and the implementation documents like handbooks. Recently, as you have seen, presented by my colleagues, we started to push all guidance into these modular consolidated guidelines. Same with the guidelines related to TB treatment and the drug-resistant TB treatment, since they were updated recently. You can see it on the right side. The most recent guidelines on treatment of drug-susceptible TB came out in 2017, but when we update these guidelines, we will use the same approach, releasing the guidelines and the related handbook. Next. So just probably a few words on the most recently updated part of the guidelines on treatment of drug-resistant TB that was released in June last year. There were several sections to these guidelines. Some of the parts have migrated from the previous versions, that they have not changed, but those highlighted in red have been the major updates on the shorter bedaquiline containing all oral regimens, some updates in the longer regimens section, and the new section on the BPAL regimen to be used under operational research. So these guidelines have been accompanied by the handbook, operational implementation handbook, and both of them were made available on WHO website. They have been presented in the workshops organized by WHO regional offices with all countries in those regions, answering questions, presenting guidelines, and also they are translated in 3 other languages than English. Let's go forward. In addition to the guidelines on drug-resistant TB treatment, and mostly because of the changes in those guidelines, we have also updated some of the normative documents related to definitions. Like, for example, after the consultation in October last year, we have updated and released a document with the new updated XDR definitions, and also the treatment outcome definitions for drug-resistant TB with the new definitions and the report of the consultation in November 2020 to be released next week. So with these kind of documents, we will continue updating whenever there is the need that is dictated by the guidelines or the implementation. Let's go ahead. But the TB treatment remains a dynamic space, and not only on drug-resistant TB, which is exciting and quite welcome, but it's also on the side of drug-susceptible TB, the area that was pretty much stable from 2017. Because you know that there are new evidence coming out, and we'll be reviewing this evidence on the 4-month quinolones-based regimen already in probably end of April this year, so it's quite soon. But on drug-resistant TB, although the guidelines, the most recent one, were released in June last year, since there will be new evidence that has been promised to us in WHO by different researchers, country programs, and we're also planning to issue a public call for data on drug-resistant TB treatment in the 2nd quarter of this year, also fairly soon. We're hoping to receive additional data that would allow us to revisit some of the important parts of the drug-resistant TB guidelines on DRTB treatment. So that would be the areas related to the all oral shorter regimens, possibly the BPAL regimen, for pre-XDR TB, according to the new definitions. We may revisit those couple of questions on bedaquiline use for longer than 6 months, or concurrent use of bedaquiline and delomanid, the efficacy answers to which questions we couldn't get in the last guideline development. But we also are thinking about looking into the co-administration of treatment of drug-resistant TB and hepatitis C, and if new data is available, to look more deeper into the use of new medicines in treatment during pregnancy. So maybe just to add to the last slide, the next slide, on these plans, something that is not directly related to the guidelines, but very important for their development, since the individual patient data has played such an important role in recent years and at least several development of the guidelines on treatment of drug-resistant TB. We are thinking to continue improving and growing this resource, trying to get more data and more updated information on new treatment regimens into the global drug-resistant TB individual patient data platform. For that, we are thinking to, and soon we will be announcing a call for very important role of the data curator, the agency or institution that will help us in WHO to maintain this data set, validate and update it, with the same vision of the contributors being the data owners, be it countries or researchers contributing the data that will be directly available for the WHO guidelines development. But we're also thinking to make sure that this would be becoming an open resource that can be available for external researchers that would be willing to mine this data and use that for possible research around the drug-resistant TB treatment. So this is kind of an interesting development that I thought I would add, since it is related to the guideline development, but has a kind of a broader possible use. So with that, I think I'll finish on the updates, and we'll leave the floor to the next presenter.
Thank you, Fouad. So I'm going to conclude this presentation now by speaking about an update in 2021 on guidelines for child and adolescent TB. So in this section, called Special Needs and Populations, currently we won't just have child and adolescent TB, but these are the plans for 2021 to update child and adolescent TB guidelines. Next slide, please. So this is the current guidance on the management of TB in children, published in 2014. This is actually the second edition. We had a first edition published in 2006. So this document, which you can see on the screen there, includes 28 recommendations, as well as some operational guidance. So it's sort of a mix between the guidelines and the operational handbook, as Dennis has shown in the earlier slides. And it contains recommendations on the following areas. So the diagnosis of both pulmonary and extrapulmonary TB in children, the treatment of TB in children with dosing information, regimens for different settings, treatment of TB in infants, and treatment of TB meningitis. It has recommendations on the prevention of TB in children, including BCG vaccination, contact screening, and what was then known as IPT, but of course now we have more options apart from isoniazid. It has a section on the management of children living with HIV infection and the management of drug-resistant TB in children. And as mentioned, it also has some operational information, such as what reporting should happen, so the age bands of reporting for surveillance of TB in children, and also information about integrated care and using a family-oriented approach. So they're the current guidelines that we have. And as I mentioned, they were published in 2014, following a guideline development group process in 2012. So next slide, please. So we're in the process of updating these guidelines on the management of TB in children and adolescents, importantly. And we've got 5 priority research questions for this guideline update. So the first one here, and this sort of covers the cascade of care for children, I guess. And the first one here is looking at diagnostic approaches for pulmonary TB in children. So in particular, we'll be looking at treatment decision algorithms for children aged less than 10 years using the WHO-approved rapid molecular diagnostic tests, but also radiology and clinical parameters, which really reflects practice in the field. We're also going to look at a question on the use of expert ultra in gastric aspirate and stool. We already have recommendations on nasopharyngeal aspirate and sputum, but we don't have recommendations on gastric aspirate and stool for ultra in particular. So we've got a question in our guideline development group meeting to look at the diagnosis of pulmonary TB and determination of rifampicin resistance in children aged less than 10 years using ultra in these 2 particular specimens. We're then going to look at the use of bedaquiline in children aged less than 6 years for the treatment of drug-resistant TB. So I think many of you will know that we currently have a recommendation for age 6 years and above. So we've got a question about bedaquiline use for the treatment of drug-resistant TB in children who are under the currently recommended age limit under 6 years. And to correspond to that, we've also got a question about the use of delaminid in children aged less than 3 years for the treatment of drug-resistant TB. And again, this complements the current recommendation, which is for use in children aged 3 years and above. So we're going to examine whether that age range can be extended further down. Now we have a non-sort of PICO question, so about how to construct optimal treatment regimens in children who are not eligible for the shorter all-oral regimens. And we're bringing together an individual patient level data set, and we'll be able to examine that question by interrogating that data set. Next slide, please. And then we've got a couple more treatment questions. So many of you will know that the results of the SHINE trial, the treatment shortening trial, were presented at the Union Conference in October last year. So we're going to look at the results of the SHINE trial. So that was a 4-month treatment regimen for children with non-severe TB compared to the current standard of care, which is the 6-month regimen. So we're going to look at that in the guideline development group meeting that's coming up, which I think will be a much welcomed advance. We're then going to look at the use of a 6-month intensive treatment regimen for TB meningitis in children and adolescents. So that will be compared to the current standard of care, which is a 12-month regimen. And then finally, we've got some key questions on the models of care for child and adolescent TB services. So decentralization of pediatric TB services, and we're looking at outcomes of TB case detection as well as TPT coverage. And then finally, family-centered integrated TB care to see if this improves TB case detection and TPT coverage in children and adolescents. So we've got a total of 5 sort of key research questions that we're going to address in these upcoming guidelines. Next slide, please. And we also have a couple of background questions that we thought were important to consider for these particular guidelines. And background questions really just help inform the guidelines overall. So we're going to look at the socioeconomic impact of TB on families. And as many of you know, we have an NTB strategy target that 0 affected families should face catastrophic costs. So we're doing a scoping review and developing a conceptual framework to look at what is the socioeconomic impact of TB on families. And of course, the idea is then to try and sort of have some interventions in place that can mitigate that impact. And then our second background question is about engaging adolescents with TB or at risk of TB in their care, looking at adolescent-friendly interventions that can be sort of incorporated into TB services to reduce stigma, discrimination, risk behaviour, etc. And we've commissioned a qualitative narrative literature review to look at that that issue, and we'll develop some best practices in adolescent TB care. Now, we have a guideline development group meeting, which is proposed for May, June. So we're working quite steadily towards that guideline development group meeting. And the idea is that by December 2021, so by the end of this year, we'll produce consolidated guidelines on the management of TB in children and adolescents. That will contain any new recommendations that arise out of these 5 questions that I've shown you on the slides, but also any existing recommendations that remain valid. And of course, there are existing recommendations in the other guidelines that you've seen today that also apply to children and adolescents. And these will be published alongside an operational handbook. And we'll go on to the microsite that Dennis has mentioned and into the app. Next slide, please. I'd just like to conclude this session by coming back to these modules that we've just talked about. So we've presented updates on guidelines for prevention, screening, diagnosis and treatment, and for child and adolescent TB this year. And I think I'll hand back to Matteo and the panel, and we'll start the discussants. Thank you. Not sure if you can hear. Can you hear? Just wondering if you can.
I can hear you. I think it's over to Matteo now, right?
Yes, yes. Over to Matteo. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
now.
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kerry, Fuad, Nazir, and Dennis for a very thoughtful presentation and with a very rich content. I encourage everyone to please write your questions in the Q&A function. We will reply directly there, but also later on in the discussion. I'd like to move now to the panel discussion. We have 4 guests, 4 distinguished speakers today with us who will help brainstorm around the need of policy guidance and research. The first speaker is Dr. Lindiwe Muzi. Dr. Muzi is the Director of TB Control and Management at the Department of Health of South Africa. I wonder whether Lindiwe can turn on the video.
Yes.
Thank you, Lindiwe. We can hear you well.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Lindiwe. Thanks a lot for joining today. The question we have for you today, and we would like a sort of 5 minutes, sort of this discussion around that, is what are, in your opinion, the unmet needs in TB policy guidance from, of course, your perspective of director of a large program of a high burden country?
Okay, thank you, Matteo. From my side, I think overall, what probably it would be useful to countries in implementing and adopting or adapting the guidelines would be the handbooks, because they tend to at least provide some clarity on the how part of it. Some of the gaps that I had identified have actually been addressed in this presentation, one being around the screening the systematic screening and the role of testing for certain high groups, considering the low sensitivity of the symptom screening tool. But would still like to expand this to other groups, particularly here looking at people with chronic diseases. Diabetics seems to be now increasing, it being an increasing risk factor for TB. We also have a huge mining community, so guidance on that, because I think we have sort of developed our guidance for the mining sector, but more research in this area in terms of what would be the most effective way of screening amongst that group, as well as the people with chronic lung diseases as another group of people that would like to expand the screening to. And then following on that, I think contact screening as well, for the same reasons, really looking at what would be more effective for screening. But I think this is also addressed in the new guidance that's coming up. The gap would then be for follow-up screening post IPT. The duration of that follow-up in HIV positive people specifically, and whether that would mean, especially in areas with high force of infection, and whether symptomatic screening would still be the most reliable to use in that group. We have, I think on the diagnostic part, the main concern has been the non-exclusion of INH resistance upfront before we actually start the treatment. And I think that again would be hopefully addressed. But then I think what we probably need to also look at is related to the case definitions, particularly for, because we tend to then not give attention to INH resistance. And in terms of monitoring those patients who have been started on treatment, and how do we monitor them post treatment. And again, you know, unpacking the group for RR and MDR so that we are able to follow the patients on RR specifically in terms of how they respond. And do they relapse at any point? Is their treatment effective in those two groups, MDR and RRTB, because it seems to be then clouded if we combine them. The other 2 points are really related to the treatment itself in terms of the optimal duration of treatment, especially in patients who are HIV positive, considering the high relapse rates. Should we be looking at increasing the duration of treatment or retain it at 6 months? There's growing arguments against retaining it at 6 months, but looking at increasing it to make sure that we reduce the relapses amongst that group. And there's also been a lot of work that's been done on shortening the duration of treatment for DRTB. And I think it's time we started looking at shorter regimens for DSTB as well. Particularly, again, looking at the ease of patients to take the medication, and those that are actually also on other morbidities, because that tends to be the group that interrupts treatment in most cases due to compounded effects of drug resistance. The other groups I think that we need more guidance on from our side would be the children, and I think that has been covered. Pregnant women, as well as healthcare workers, in terms of what would be, what updating basically the evidence and the guidelines related to that. Those were my points around this. I think the others have been covered in some of the presentations. On TB prevention, I must say that there are a lot of gaps in that area. The guidelines really are not useful in terms of translating them to implementation, particularly because the situations, especially in low-income countries, medium to low-income countries, the infrastructure is a problem. Investing in ventilation, controlled ventilation is also a challenge. So it becomes a huge problem actually to implement some of those guidelines. And looking as well at the role of secondary TPT for patients, and at what point would you consider reinitiating a patient on TPT? Thanks, that's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Lindiwe, for the very thoughtful feedback. Again, if colleagues have questions, please put them on the chat. We will have a discussion session in a while. I would like now to call the second speaker that we have. His name is Mike Frick. Mike is a senior project officer at the Treatment Action Group based in New York City. Don't know if Mike can hear me and whether I can put on his video. Yes, hi Mike. Hey. Thank you very much for joining today and for taking time to talk to us. One question we would like to pose to you is how can we work better to shape research to inform and address these unmet policy needs that we have, particularly to support, countries. That is our ultimate goal. Can you share your thoughts on this? Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Matteo. Hi to everyone. Nice to be here with you today, and thanks to the WHO Global TB Program for organizing today's webinar and asking me to speak. I think it's really important that TB programs, civil society, and researchers have a clear sightline into TB policy guidance and changes, and today's event is an important part of that. And to the question that you've asked me, Matteo, I think as much as we need WHO guidance and national TB programming to continually evolve to reflect the latest, highest standard of scientific evidence, we also need the science itself to reflect and respond to the evolving needs of TB programs. And so on this score, there were a couple of things that I wanted to raise for discussion. The first is, I think, the need to set up our research to produce the kind of evidence that WHO requires to issue clear, strong guidelines that national programs can act on with confidence, clarity, and minimal qualification. I think that for product development, in particular, research to develop new tools for prevention, diagnosis, and treatment, there is still a tendency among too many sponsors to set the finish line of research at regulatory approval by a stringent authority such as FDA or EMA. And I think the ultimate goal should really be regulatory approval paired with the strongest possible recommendation made by WHO on the highest quality evidence. And so knowing how WHO guidelines are based on the grade methodology and how that judges the certainty or quality of evidence and then issues a strength of recommendation, I think we really need to ensure that the research we're doing leads to strong recommendations. And for me, this highlights a couple of things. One is the importance of maintaining randomized controlled trials as a gold standard for TB clinical trials wherever possible, and especially in relation to research questions where the answer has the potential to make a major change to the standard of care. The second is, the recognizing the important role that operational research and implementation science play in support of RCTs. And so to produce strong evidence-based policy, I think we need a kind of multifaceted research agenda centered on RCTs, but supported by rigorous operational research to fill in knowledge gaps and to help adapt technologies to local contexts and real-world conditions. It's not an either or, they're not in competition, they really need to go together. One is the anchor and the other kind of, provides a supporting ballast. So over the past, 5 to 10 years, we've seen how having regulatory approval alone isn't enough to quickly motivate widespread policy change if new tools are approved with weak evidence or with myriad gaps in knowledge that lead to conditional recommendations. And so research that yields strong recommendations based on high quality evidence, I think, could lead to clearer guidelines, faster uptake, more equitable access to new technologies and interventions. And simply put, how we do our research determines the type of recommendations we can make from it and the strength of the policies that come out of those recommendations. So that was my first reflection. The second is, I think, the need to continue mainstreaming community engagement as a critical component of every TB research endeavor. And there's a lot that can be said on this topic, but I want to focus on one piece of community engagement in particular, which is that we need a much more systematic approach to eliciting the priorities and preferences of people affected by TB at the outset, before major research projects begin, so that we can design a research agenda that is truly responsive, relevant, and people-centered. We should have answers, or at least a good idea about questions like, how do people with TB value trade-offs between length of treatment and treatment toxicity? For TB preventive therapy, is there a preference between daily versus once weekly dosing? How do communities feel about the role of TB preventive therapy and its incorporation into trials of new TB vaccines, if we're studying kind of different prevention modalities? I think too often these questions are things that we answer after the fact, when we're already 5 or 10 years into implementing a research agenda and are trying to put together the values and preferences section of the grade table at a WHO guidelines development group meeting. And I think we should do this important work earlier. We need a really rigorous program of good social science built on a foundation of participatory community involvement, so that communities can define the needs from which research questions are pulled out and the agenda is set. I think it's really about determining the acceptability of new TB tools up front when there's still an opportunity to do something about it. And we're used to thinking of community engagement in terms of TB drug research and increasingly TB vaccine trials as well. But I think there's a huge and mostly unexplored need for more engagement in TB diagnostics research in particular, to define research priorities, to shape the characteristics of TB diagnostic tools that are needed, and to ensure the inclusion of diverse populations in diagnostic evaluation, development, and validation studies. So my third point is, I would really like donors and funders to start thinking in terms of how we can design research to create both kind of predictability, to the extent possible, sustainability and efficiencies. And to this end, I think it'd be good to start talking about research platforms, platforms for good clinical trials and good TB science, platforms which allow for continuous research and create flexibilities for adjusting research as new evidence emerges and policies and priorities may change. One example of this idea is a concept that my TAG colleague, Lindsay McKenna, is calling the CHEETAH proposal, like cheetah as in the animal, which stands for Chasing Expedited and Equitable Treatment Access for Children. The idea behind CHEETAH would be to establish a platform trial for pediatric TB drug research based on a common protocol, from which simple protocol amendments could be made, allowing researchers to add on investigations of novel drugs as they come through the pipeline and are ready for pediatric work. The platform could include research sites in different countries and regions for geographic diversity. And during any downtime, the platform could keep those sites humming and active by filling pediatric research gaps for older TB drugs, or, contribute pediatric samples to biorepositories to support biomarker or diagnostics research. We could imagine a similar kind of adaptable platform for drug-resistant TB phase 3 work, or dose optimization work, or regimen optimization work being built on kind of the tremendous investment that donors like Untitled have made in developing drug-resistant TB clinical trial sites through the NTB project. Establishing, platforms of this type, I think, could create real efficiencies, shorten the time between different phases of research, or the gap between adult and pediatric research, and ultimately support more frequent and flexible policy change. It's an idea that is sort of like some of the TB research networks we have now in EDCTP, ACTG, TBTC, and others, except that I think, to imagine research in terms of these platforms would really be to see it in a mission mode, focused on tackling specific ongoing research needs, such as pediatric drug development, regimen optimization, preventive therapy, studying new preventive therapy regimens in terms of their safety and timing in regard to pregnancy, or similar questions that could be addressed in this fashion. And in concluding, I guess, like Lindiwe did, I want to highlight just a few kind of gaps that I think we need additional research to help fill. One is the importance of understanding the individual or independent contributions of new TB medicines that we're developing as part of novel regimens. We have a healthy drug development pipeline, lots of compounds entering phase 2 development. It's a really exciting time, and the focus is rightly on developing these drugs in combinations as new regimens. But I think as we pursue this, we should also be thinking about how we can understand how the individual drugs contribute to the strength, efficacy, or toxicity of regimens. And related to this is understanding how drugs in the same class compare. Today this is relevant for delaminid and pertominid. I think it'll be relevant for new oxazolidinone compounds, like comparing linezolid to sitazolid, or some of the other new compounds in that class that are being developed. And then finally, I think there's an enormous amount of work to be done on the theme of TBs and special populations, and that module in particular, TB, multimorbidity, and vulnerability, understanding the needs of key populations, such as, for example, people who use drugs who may typically be excluded from clinical trials and may be living with TB, with HIV, with viral hepatitis, or people with diabetes and TB, or now TB and COVID-19 multimorbidity. I think there are so many questions about TB risk and vulnerability that we're just beginning to unpack, and I wanted to highlight those. So thank you for the chance for discussion, and looking forward to the other comments, and back to you, Matteo.
Thank you very much, Mike. A very, very thoughtful feedback. We will resume with the discussion soon after the panel session, and we look forward to discussing further those ideas. The next speaker that we have today is Professor Jeremiah Chakaya. I see you there, Chakaya. Thanks for joining. Dr. Chakaya is professor of global respiratory health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Is a well-known public health authority, I would say, in tuberculosis. Thanks, Chakaya, for joining and for spending some time with us today. The question we have for you today is, we are all experiencing a tragedy this year with COVID-19, and many countries are really sort of paralyzed with their services sort of shut down. And so the question for you is how we could better streamline efforts to ensure that we maximize the work to fight COVID for the benefit of TB, and so that TB doesn't get neglected, throughout this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Matteo, and I hope that you can all hear me. Thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel today to talk about an extremely important situation that we are all experiencing, COVID-19 and the effects of COVID-19 on the disease that many of us have committed our professional lives to over many years, tuberculosis. We know that tuberculosis was for a very, very long time the #1 infectious killer of human beings, but unfortunately COVID-19 overtook it, dislodged it from that spot in 2020, and we don't know how long COVID-19 is going to continue to occupy that position. We know that there is some overlap in the presentation of COVID-19, especially principally through cough, but we all know that sharp clinicians should very easily be able to distinguish between COVID-19 and tuberculosis. COVID-19 is a much more acute illness, while tuberculosis has a tendency to be an insidious illness. We know that at this moment in time, data on the interaction between tuberculosis and COVID-19, although some data is coming through, in my view, it's not coming through fast enough for us to be able to make policies and practice recommendations that are nicely evidence-based. So I think the #1 thing that I would urge all of us to do is to encourage researchers and countries to continue collecting data on the interaction between COVID-19 and tuberculosis. I think there are several issues that one would want to look at that in that interaction. One, of course, is what happens to people who have both TB and COVID-19 at the same time. Do either of these diseases become severer? Are the outcomes poorer? Or what happens in those situations? I think that's an extremely important question that at this moment in time, we do not seem to have as robust data as we would like to. Then, of course, there's what we have focused our attention on, which is the issue of the responses to COVID-19 and how those responses impact on the TB epidemic, as it were. Now, we know that for all sorts of reasons, lockdowns and travel restrictions that have been imposed and the economic downturn that is happening all over the world, it's been estimated that up to 500 million people might slide down the poverty scale. And if they slide down the poverty scale, one would expect that there'll be a resurgence, or rather tuberculosis will get the upper hand going forward. And many more people would have TB, and eventually a lot more people could die from TB because of an increase in poverty and its association with tuberculosis. So we need to be aware that this situation with COVID-19 is extremely important for those of us in the TB space. But it's not just in the TB space. I think it's also similar to other diseases, and we should all be focused on health and well-being of people out there. I believe that this situation, like we saw in the Ebola epidemics in Western Africa, for example, the effect of the Ebola on maternal mortality, for example, or malaria deaths. So these things should not be taken lightly. COVID-19 is likely to have major health effects beyond COVID itself, and we need to be very familiar with that. I want to bring us to the issue of what happens with a huge number of people out there that often we don't seem to talk about who have post-TB chronic lung disease. And at this moment in time, we don't have data, we don't have information to tell us what happens to people who have post-TB chronic lung disease and the effects that they would have in terms of whether the disease, COVID-19, would be more severe in those populations. We know that both diseases, TB and COVID-19, are associated with strong stigma. And the issue is, how do we deal with both TB and COVID-19 stigma as we address both diseases going forward? I think it's also important, I think we've spent quite a bit of time to look at health responses to COVID-19 and how those influence our responses to the TB problem. So very highly likelihood that COVID-19 responses have diverted resources from TB responses and therefore worsening the TB situation. So if you take all these things into consideration, the issue is, what can we do going forward to confront both tuberculosis and COVID-19? I think many people have urged that there should be integrated responses, and I am a very strong proponent of ensuring that, in fact, responses should be as integrated as they can be. And this means utilizing the human resources, the infrastructure, the diagnostics that needs to go together to fight these two health threats, as it were. I think we should not forget research to shape up the data to help us have robust data that we can base our policies and recommendations on. I think it's important that we have continued strong advocacy to ensure that tuberculosis is not neglected as we fight what looks like a bigger threat to human health, which is due to COVID-19. So really, really important that we continue the push to ensure that not only do we remain with what I would call continuation of services, but we could actually ramp up those services to get a lot more people to come onto treatment for TB so that we can narrow our proportion of incidence versus a number of people who are identified to have TB. And this would require that we strongly engage with communities to be able to make them understand, or rather partner with them for very strong responses to emerge at the community level. And I think finally, things are changing. And the question is, yes, we seem to be, with the development of vaccines and the rollout of vaccine strategies, which unfortunately the parts of the world that is most affected by TB, it seems to be lagging behind in terms of deployment of current vaccines, something that I think we need to work on to try and address. However, I'm thinking really about the future. It does look to me that if these vaccine programs work, COVID-19 might eventually be brought down to its knees, and we will remain with our TB problem, and it will jump back to the number one cause of death from one single infectious disease. So what should the future look like? How do we prepare ourselves for future epidemics and pandemics, and how do we in fact prevent future epidemics and pandemics? I think that's a big question. We in the TB world appear not to have been prepared for this pandemic. I'm not quite sure, maybe people in the room know whether there was in fact scenarios that were built around a global pandemic like this and what it would mean for TB. But now that this has happened, I think we need to always be on the lookout, because I suspect that there will be, if we do not change the way our world is going, there will probably be many more epidemics and pandemics going forward. And we need to be prepared, and that issue needs to take center stage in driving the world to ensure that we are prepared and to prevent the horrendous effects that can come from pandemics of this nature, not just because of the pandemic itself, but also the effects of those pandemics on diseases like tuberculosis and other things that affect human health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chakaya, for your feedback and for your thoughts today. I'd like to move on to the last speaker that we have today before opening for a discussion. I'd like to introduce Dr. Ezio Tavora. As you know, Ezio, if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Ezio Tavora is a member of the WHO Civil Society Task Force, and he will talk a bit about how civil society and affected communities can really drive the demand for the scale up of evidence-based intervention. And this is basically following one of the points raised by Mike earlier. Thank you, Ezio. Sure.
Thank you, Matteo. Thank you for the Global TB program for the kind invitation, and I'm very glad to be here today with you. It is a big privilege, and I thank you very much for that. For us to be driving, for us to be helping establishing and implementing new technologies or implementing guidelines. I mean, there is a prior request is that people understand what science is and how science is produced, and also the policy and the policy aspect, or how the decision making occurs, how this functions. So there is an aspect that we can produce and elaborate guidelines from the international level. And in this sense, we have been doing a tremendous progress in the last years with the inclusion of community representatives, both from the WHO Civil Society Task Force and other community representatives in all the guideline development groups and all the technical consultation. So this progress has been tremendous in the last year. So this part is partially solved because we have community members who are research literate to be discussing and to be following up the guideline development discussion. Yet, what we want at the end of the day is the implementation on the country level. And for that, it requires engagement in different parts. Mike has very correctly said that we have to integrate the communities affected and listen to them prior to the design of the studies and have the answers to the questions that we have. I remember back in 2016 when I was establishing the CAB of the STREAM study in Georgia. I was networking with the drug users network, and they said, like, how can a study benefit us if we are not included among the trial participants? How if we are not going to be studied? I mean, because people take drugs, people drink alcohol, people have other disease, like Mike has very correctly put. But we want from the design of the studies up to the implementation, not even in the approval, the regulatory process in the country level. We want to see the policies implemented, the best study results implemented. And for that, we need support to engage the communities and increase the treatment and research literacy, and also help them driving and understanding the scenario scenario of policy making for the implementation of study of science in every country. For that, we need investment, which is not yet there. I mean, some initiatives like we had the USAID support for different studies, engagement in the Treat TB grant that had different studies, and there was community engagement in there. I mean, the TB Alliance has been doing this since at the beginning of its studies, but not all the studies are there. This should be a strong request from the recommendation from WHO that donors should have communities engaged and funded within the budget of the studies. I mean, a clinical trial should not run without a community advisory board. Even a basic science study should consult with the communities and share the protocol, make understanding what is happening. So for this, you have to build this engagement. This requires funding. This requires time. I mean, because the TB advocates, they are there dealing with the limitations of services, etc., or dealing with the programs and trying to improve the quality of the programs. But what we need to is to have more data. In the guidelines development group, very often we see approaches or considering economic aspects and user satisfaction in detached studies. For example, we analyze studies from the economic point of view, or the cost for the trial patient or the trial participants, or the catastrophic cost, etc., if that is occurring or not. Or we have sometimes the user satisfaction. Sometimes with one case, I know that it's a qualitative study can accept that, but in a study that has 800 or 1,200 trial participants, we have to have data from the studies. We have to have that included, the economic aspect, the users, the satisfaction, how people access the services, how the services are actually functioning. And this is of direct interest of each government. The governments need to have this information, because we just did a huge study in Brazil by the civil society on the impact of COVID in the TB and HIV policies. And what we see is a clear detachment from, this is obvious, we just proved that the program managers think the reality is one, the reality for the users, the people who seek treatment is another one. And in the middle are the healthcare workers dealing with other realities. So we have to inform the governments, we have to inform the services, we have to inform the system. And for that, we have to participate. I mean, in the last years, there is the precedent of the Global Fund CCMs that has helped in many countries to establish a communication between communities and governments and programs. This is very positive, but we have to have a step forward. We have to continue investing in funding the structures that will allow communities to participate, not only in research follow-up, but also in policy implementation. So this doesn't occur by naturally, that has to be an investment. HIV has progressed that earlier, because the clinical trials in HIV and AIDS require the establishment of community advisory boards. And we should do that as a request, mandatory item. And again, the engagement of communities should never be when the protocols are done. the answers have to be to questions that are of the interest of each country. To finalize, we can only do that if we do pragmatic studies, if we work on translational studies, if we think on the translational science, I mean communication among science, and to improve a better result. So that way we can inform the governments and the programs successfully. But again, this requires time, this requires investment, continued investment, and this is a process that is ongoing. I cited examples of the STREAM study, the Prove It study that we did in Brazil earlier by the Treat TB grant. We have the TB Alliance, we have other initiatives, Mike mentioned a few, but the TBTC from the CDC in Atlanta has funded the CRAG and other CABs to support locally the studies run by that, but we have to have that in every study. Again, this is a long process. That doesn't happen rapidly. In the international level, again, we have done a huge progress in these last years with the engagement of community representatives in GDG. Sometimes we have 3 or 4 community members in GDG. So this is excellent. But we have to work on a country level. We want to see the best evidence being implemented in the country. And we have, to finalize, another thing that we have to do that people don't. We have to evaluate prior policies. If we are talking about a new diagnostic, we have to understand how the previous implementation went and how this has been functioning in real conditions. If we want to have a prevention therapy, we have to understand how isoniazid IPT has not functioned globally in the last years. Where are the bottlenecks? Where are the problems? If we do not evaluate that, we will fail to implement new technologies. And when I talk about technology, it's not a diagnostic, it's a new compound, it's a new drug, it's a new guideline. So sorry for taking so much time, but I'll be looking forward for discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ezio. Very important points you have raised. I like to now really start a discussion. We have received several questions. Thanks a lot for those who managed to put them in the Q&A function. Maybe I like to start from the points raised by Chakaya on the need of data and on COVID and TB, and maybe ask Dennis, who is focal point department for COVID and TB, to answer a couple of questions that came in the chat on COVID. The first one is about whether we have any guidance as WHO on TB and COVID. And the second one is about the vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines, and whether there are risks for TB. Over to you, Dennis.
Hi, thank you very much, Matteo, and thanks everyone for this very animated discussion. With regards to COVID, so our guidance, we have tried to summarize it in these information notes that we have been producing over the last year. Within them, we're very much kind of trying to point out key areas where we expect overlap between the COVID sort of investigations and TB sort of TB action and efforts, such as, for instance, the issues relating to infection control or issues relating to contact investigation, for instance, or diagnostics. So you can find these information notes. We had issued the last one in December. We want to as well keep updating these information notes, for instance, with new developments now on the COVID vaccine, what to do with the new screening guidelines, because of course, again, that brings into perspective the contact investigation instance. So so you will find these on the website. We also have other resources that have been put together. NAATs, for instance, herself has been very active to put a hub where we put updates about studies where they're linking up TB and COVID. We also have, with the help of many of you, put together as well a compendium of case studies from countries, including like small abstracts about what countries have been doing to innovate, to keep TB on the agenda during the pandemic period. And this is, I think, an important thing, and which we'll be publishing shortly. Now, with respect to the vaccines, so the COVID vaccine for TB patients, there is no contraindication for people who have TB or past TB to take the vaccine. Actually, those who would have sort of compromised lung function from TB or from concomitant disease should be actually prioritized for the COVID vaccine. We do not have a lot of evidence at this point in time, documented evidence, to show that any TB past or present would be a risk factor for complicated COVID outcomes. There are some data that show that TB patients, amongst other individuals who get COVID, have a higher risk of dying from, but of course that is known as well for people who do not have COVID. So we still need some proper data on, let's say, prospective risks, for instance, in people who have had COVID during their, if in the following period they would have had, they would develop TB, for instance, is the likelihood of TB then to be more severe. So again, country prioritization on vaccination, it cannot be automatic on any diagnosis of TB, but of course, people who have TB and have secondary effects should be considered in the prioritization, local prioritization of for COVID vaccination.
Thank you, Dennis. Since you are here, maybe I take advantage to ask you another question that came up on the screening guidelines. We understand that the screening will be launched, disseminated next week, so we are not yet in the position to disclose recommendations today. It will be done next week. But there were a couple of interesting questions on CAD, and whether basically the question were related to which kind of softwares could be used, and whether there would be any support from WHO on the use of CAD.
Right. So the recommendation, as it is a recommendation for the class of products. So we are saying that CAD can be used to interpret pulmonary chest X-rays, plain chest X-rays for TB, as you would interpret it with a trained worker like a radiologist. So in places where they do not have enough capacity to interpret chest X-rays, they could use CAD and they could rely on the results coming out of that. So as part of that, one of the tools that we have prepared is meant to calibrate CAD to a local requirements. For instance, if countries would want to use CAD to increase the sensitivity of the test, they can choose one threshold coming out of the product itself, which comes out with an abnormality score. You can adjust that threshold to decide what to accept as progressing towards the next step of doing diagnostic testing if they go over the threshold, for instance. Or else you can choose a higher threshold so that you cut down on the requirements for diagnostic testing if you have a lot of false positives, for instance, and you want to refine the tool. So WHO is making available this CAD protocol. We are working with our colleagues in TDR who are building a website with a package inside it, which will have links to a number of these products. There is an online tool which can be used for calculations and simulations, and then there is also a protocol that countries can use to adapt it with 2 different study designs which they can use depending on their context. We are also, given that the recommendation are generic, they will not be saying you can use this software but not this one. We are also working with our colleagues at pre-qualification in order to develop an approach by which software developers can apply to the PQ system so that they will have a judgment made on their software. The software will be evaluated by a group of experts and then tested again on an independent kind of source of digital X-rays in order to assess its proficiency against a kind of an independent database of X-rays and information about patients.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I like to move on now on another point raised by one of our guests and panelists. Lindiwe pointed out among the different gaps, the challenges that countries are encountering to scale up TB preventive measures. Maybe here I would like maybe Nazir to comment a bit on the work on which is coming up on assessing evidence on tests for TB infection, which we hope will fill in one of the gaps that we have for the diagnosis of TB infection. And there were a couple of questions, Nazir, in the Q&A. If you could elaborate a bit more about, what we mean about tests for TB infections, and if you could also speak to the focus of the upcoming guidelines.
Okay, thanks a lot, Matteo, and thanks for the colleagues that put the questions out for clarification. So, as I indicated, the guideline meeting in the second half of the year will focus on tests for TB infection. I think also to be quite clear is that in terms of prevention, for certain categories of people, testing is not a prerequisite, right? So we're not necessarily adding additional barriers, but I think the important thing with TB testing is that the landscape of test options is expanding, at least in the blood-based testing field. And there are simpler options, so that's becoming more relevant as we look at population that need testing. And I think more importantly is the skin-based testing. So we are aware of the challenges that have been faced around availability of TST. And with the new developments, there's been new skin-based tests that have been that are now available. These are TB specific. So just to clarify one of the questions that was in the chat. So classically, the TST test has been around for almost a century, right? But really it's sort of a crude composite of antigens that elicit an immune response, whereas these new formats of tests include 2 specific TB antigens, the ESAT6 and the CFP10. So providing specificity for TB reaction and sort of not cross-reacting with BCG or NTMs for that matter. So there are important new additions that provide an alternative and have the potential to be a bit more specific than what we have for TST. So that's kind of the scope of the TB infection testing that we'll be looking at in the second half of the year. There was also an additional question around the price points for these skin tests. So this is difficult to say. I mean, there's different products. There's one from Russia. That is the Diaskin test. There's a CTB test that's coming out from Serum Institute in India. There's an easy test from China. So there's a variety of different products that are coming onto market. The GDG will be looking at multiple elements, qualitative assessments, but also economic assessments. And that's when we look at the price points for these different tests. So I can't really comment on their price points right now, but it's part of the evidence review.
Thank you very much, Nazir. Thanks a lot. I'm reading the questions now, and I see another one which has come up, and maybe I will ask Fuad to comment on that. There has been a plea from Chakaya, from Mike, and from also Ezio to invest in generation of data and collection of data. And there have been a couple of questions, 3 questions actually on the WHO IPD, which is a tool that we use for to collect and analyze data for guidelines development. I like, Fuad, if you could talk a bit about our plans for the IPD, particularly there was a question on the risks of IPD, because this is not a control, is not a clinical trial, it's not a controlled data set, and of course there is a risk that what we can get out of it could be biased depending on the type of data that we get. And also, if you could elaborate more on the next steps that we are planning. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Matteo, and thank you everyone who were asking the question on this last slide that I presented, where I touched upon our plans for IPD dataset. Maybe just to clarify on those. For the IPD, you know that there is the data set that we've been using several times in the guidelines development, and it was in collaboration with the McGill University, and we want to continue this initiative and actually make it grow it further, add more data, since many programs and a lot of observational data from countries that are reaching the higher quality levels, and countries are moving towards electronic data collection, which helps to make it easier available. But we also want to make sure that this data doesn't always sit in one place, but be available for external researchers. So in a way to help stimulate the training into research and development around the drug-resistant TB treatment. Of course, it's not because we prefer this kind of operation research observational data to the randomized control trials. It's of course the RCTs, the data, the evidence delivered by RCTs are pinnacle of the quality of the data that we can have for WHO guidelines development. But unfortunately, we are not always in a space where there is a lot of spending. The budget is available for the research, and not a lot of RCTs are happening in TB, and we just cannot sit and ignore the massive amounts of the data that is being available from different researchers and many research projects in countries. So that's why we've been using this the massive of data, and it's important to also to say that while there are major disadvantages, I think that it doesn't have this all fancy blinding, randomization, etc. But it has the advantage of being high numbers. We know that the current data set includes more than 13,000 individual patient records. And also it's coming from patients that being managed in the conditions that are closer to the real time situation, the programmatic conditions. That's also an important feature, because we know that trial conditions are way above of what countries and programs can do on the ground. So that's why, while there are many issues with the observational data, with individual patient data set, we still believe that, you know, as it was done in the past with using some modern statistical methods, many of those problems can be overcome to a certain extent and still make a useful contribution to the policy development. Therefore, we thought that it would be good to continue and growing this resource. Of course, as I think some of the questions indicated, there will be a certain amount, since this is a dynamic space, the TB treatment, we are moving ahead, the regimens change. There might be less value in some data that is in the IPD now on the older treatment regimens. Of course, we are not going to discard or scrap that. It will still be there, but of course, when analyzing and trying to compare this and using this data for the analysis, we have to take into account and maybe exclude parts of data that has that older regimens, which can be electronically fairly easily, can be done fairly easily. And of course, as we go ahead, we should update the variables and make sure that, for example, we include the same variables as we have for the current drugs, for the new drugs that are being used. So there are, of course, certain updates that we're already considering in terms of the variables, and since the change of the certain definitions happened, that we will already implement in the upcoming public call for data on drug-resistant TB treatment. And obviously, when we go ahead with this IPD development, the IPD platform will be updating the dictionary of data, etc. So I hope that covers some of those points that I've seen in the question and answer section on the IPD data set. Matteo, back to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Fuad. I think this is extremely helpful, and as you say, we will issue very soon a public call for a data curator for this IPD. I think I'd like to move on maybe with the question for Kerry, if possible. I see there's lots of interest around the upcoming guidelines on childhood TB. Is long waited, and it's extremely important topic. And there were a couple of questions. One is what happens if you know, as part of this GDG, there will be updates and how we can relate them to maybe existing recommendations. And I think this is an important point. And maybe if you can elaborate a bit more about, you know, the children living with HIV, and whether these guidelines will focus on that group or not.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. No, thank you for those questions, everyone, and Matteo. So yes, as mentioned, the guidelines on the management of child and adolescent TB will be a consolidated guideline. So they'll include any existing recommendations that remain valid from the 2014 guidelines, and not all of those recommendations remain valid, actually. Some of them are already outdated. but the ones that are will be carried over. And then any new recommendations that arise from the guideline development group process will be incorporated into the consolidated guidelines, as well as any other recommendations in other WHO guidelines. So for example, we've spoken today about the new screening guidelines. We've obviously got treatment guidelines and diagnostic recommendations that apply to children and adolescents. Now, I think the question was sort of, you know, will that all be coordinated? And I guess the answer is yes. So we're working very closely with the other teams to make sure that we align with, say, for example, the guideline development groups on drug susceptible and drug resistant TB that will take place this year. So we're sort of trying to align all of those guidelines so that when we do develop consolidated guidelines, they only contain the most recent and existing recommendations. And obviously we're doing lots of internal work to sort of ensure consistency. And the other place, of course, where the recommendations will appear is on the microsite. And in that section of the microsite where we have recommendations, so they will all be current and existing recommendations, and there'll be a process to take out recommendations that are superseded, I guess. So I hope that answers that question. And just to go to the TB HIV question, as mentioned, we have 5 priority research questions in the child and adolescent TB guidelines. We don't have a specific question on the co-treatment of TB and HIV. There has been a recent guideline update from the HIV department, and in fact, they've addressed that question, and we expect a new recommendation on that quite soon. However, for the other priority research questions, people with HIV, children and adolescents, are a specified subpopulation. So we'll be doing sub-analyses stratified by people living with HIV for child and adolescents. And in the SHINE trial, for example, we know that about 10% of patients in both the intervention regimen and the control regimen had HIV infection. So certainly, as much as possible, we'll be stratifying all of those PICO questions by HIV infection and by other variables such as the different age groups, severe acute malnutrition, etc. So yeah, there's not a specific question on TB HIV co-treatment, but we'll be looking at that as much as possible within the PICO questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. That's very clear. I hope we have given enough information. We have actually reached the end of our webinar. I think it's been a very rich discussion and very thoughtful inputs from our panelists. I will immediately hand it over to my director, Dr. Teresa Casaeva, for the final remarks and for the closing of the webinar. Thanks a lot for attending this webinar.
Yes, thank you, Matteo. So, dear colleagues, indeed, it was a very, very rich discussion, and our webinar is coming to an end. And I would like to thank all the panelists, all the participants, presenters, and most importantly, thank you all engaged for your engagement, for prioritization, TB in your busy agendas. Thank you for questions, very reasonable and relevant questions you put in the quick Q&A box, and thank you for sharing your views and perspectives. All this is very important for us. It can guide us where and how we should move forward, and of course in close collaboration with all of you. Of course, there are also many other ongoing works to facilitate uptake and scale up of interventions in line with the NTB strategy, UN high-level meeting political declaration, and its targets, and also according to the request from the recent progress report from the UN Secretary General. So also few more pre-announcement. This year Global TB Program is also updating the toolkit for development of the national TB strategic plans. and as well as tools to support with the operationalization of the multi-sectoral accountability framework. I've seen the questions also on the reporting framework. The definitions and reporting framework for tuberculosis is also being updated to align with the latest development. Also, we didn't cover, and it was not possible due to the time limited, a very important work on monitoring and evaluation. And many things are happening also there. We are trying to be more proactive, more innovating, and probably two important things could be brought for your attention. In addition to our annual global TB report, we've started actually already last year, but this year we formalized, agreed with the countries on monthly data reporting, and this is big step forward, especially during the COVID crisis. It's important to monitor the TB notification, and we could see, unfortunately, significant drops in many high TB burden countries, but now this data will be officially reported, and we've already receiving from at least 84 countries this close to real-time data. Another important update will be with the high burden country list. It will come also soon, following our commitments and the same principles of the development we are updating. And so more details will come later. So we are planning to have these webinars on regular basis. We've already started last year. We had several thematic webinars on multi-sectoral accountability framework, TB, and different comorbidities aligned with the world, the different WHO days as mental health day, with diabetes, and we will continue also with this. The dates will be announced in due course, and we look forward to your continued participation and engagement in these processes. Thank you once again for your attention, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.